In this video, we're reviewing 20 of the best black and white horror movies. Seriously, I don't know what it is, but something about these old classics makes them scarier than the newer movies. It could be the lack of color, creating an unnatural vibe, analog technology used for filming, or just their storytelling style. Alright, let's start talking about these monochromatic works of art. But before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. So thank you. Let's begin. The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, 1920. A man named Francis starts a conversation with an older man on a park bench, telling his story. Francis and his friend Alan visit the town fair and encounter an enigmatic man, watching his sideshow attraction. This man, Dr. Caligari, opens a coffin-shaped box to reveal a somnambulist named Cesare. The sleeping man answers questions from the audience, predicting Alan's death the following day. To Francis' horror, Alan is murdered in his sleep that night, and this prompts Francis to investigate with the help of his love interest, Jane. Francis spies on Caligari, spotting what appears to be a sleeping Cesare. Meanwhile, the real Cesare abducts Jane. Luckily for Jane, Cesare dies of exhaustion when an angry mob chases him and frees her. Francis follows Caligari, finding out he's the director of an asylum. He then confronts Caligari, not before calling the police on him, which leads to Caligari becoming a prisoner in his own asylum. In the present, a ridiculous twist ending concludes the story, turning it upside down. One of the most influential films of all time, and a pioneer in multiple fronts, Caligari is still remembered fondly after a century. The twist ending and the deep uncertainty of the final sequence make it hard to forget. It embodied the essence of the times after World War I, when Germany struggled. Expressionism was a raging art movement. It was called one of the first actual horror films. And lastly, the set design truly set it apart from anything else in that era. Psycho, 1960. The disappearance murder of a young woman leads her boyfriend and sister to hire an investigator, who later goes missing as well. The suspect, Norman, seems quite reserved at first glance, but his weird relationship with his mother appears to be a tie to all these events. When the duo investigates Norman further, they find out that his mother had died about a decade ago. He must be impersonating his mother for unknown reasons. The truth unfolds soon when the duo finds out that Norman's mother is mummified in his cellar, while he dresses as his mother, going about murdering innocent people. This film must have been quite the thriller when it was released. It just sucks that time loves giving spoilers. This film is one such example. It's hard to enjoy the movie today because of how much it affected the whodunit subgenre of horror movies. Almost all the tropes and twists in this film are now done to death, but we must appreciate the ingenuity of Psycho to be such a significant influence in normalizing these tropes in the first place. Lastly, it was a pretty controversial entry for Hitchcock, since the amount of nudity, level of violence, and the cross-dressing aspect were primarily frowned upon at the time. Oni Baba, 1964. At the beginning of the Nanbokucho period, in the 14th century near Kyoto, two soldiers are ambushed and murdered while on the run. The murderers, a woman with her young daughter-in-law, loot the men, leaving them bare naked in a deep pit made for the job. Quite the norm for these women, as they take advantage of the war and deserting soldiers to sell their belongings to make a living. Things take a turn when their neighbor, Hachi, returns from war and gets romantically involved with the daughter-in-law, who learns of her husband's death from Hachi. One day, a samurai with a hanya mask asks the older woman for directions, but is tricked into falling into the pit. She pulls out the mask with great difficulty and sees a disfigured face behind it. Later, she uses the mask to scare her daughter-in-law at night in an attempt to stop her from pursuing a relationship with Hachi. She receives problems of her own when she finds herself unable to remove the mask, implying that the rainfall has activated the demonic curse within it. Her daughter-in-law agrees to help her remove it if she stops interfering in her romantic life, but doesn't know that Hachi was killed in an altercation. The movie abruptly ends with the broken mask revealing a heavily disfigured face, as seen in The Samurai, and the daughter-in-law runs away from the older woman. She jumps into the pit, the older woman following soon after. Wow, this one was quite the roller coaster. From its abrupt ending to totally unexpected events, Oni Baba keeps the viewer engaged, albeit with quite some food-eating and romantic scenes. The film received a mixed review back then, mentioning the same issues. The film does swing back and forth from exciting and adventurous to mellow and somber. As for why you should watch it, why not? There's nothing like it today. It's a rare amalgamation of human drama combined with horror.
They have to be destroyed. All of them.
They will be. Every one of them. Listen, we're gonna have to search every building, every house in town.
Invasion of the Body Snatchers, 1956. A doctor named Miles is brought to the emergency room of a hospital in LA. A psychiatrist, Dr. Hill, soon meets with him, and he recalls the events leading up to his arrival. Miles talks about the town of Santa Mira, where a progressively increasing number of people seem to suffer from Capgras delusion. If you don't know what that is, look it up. It's pretty disturbing. Except that in this case, the townspeople are actually being replaced. Miles found that out when he met his friend in his place, and discovered a dead body with no facial features. They quickly discover that giant alien pods are creating clones of people and replacing them in their sleep. Later, they find out that almost everyone has been replaced by the unknown entity, and must stay awake not to be replaced. The pod people seem to be an extraterrestrial life form, responsible for the invasion, their goal being to replace every human on Earth. After an escape, he finds a colossal greenhouse farm with hundreds of seed pods being loaded into trucks for transport. The film ends when another person arrives at the emergency room with a similar tale. This one is quite fun to watch. The story feels tense and well written. The most noteworthy fact is that the film came out when extraterrestrial-themed films were all the rage, and stood out on their own. The funniest thing, though, is that it is one of the films that appealed to both political sides, who believed the pod people to be a representation of communists, while the other who thought they were mindless cogs of the capitalist machine instead. Unfortunately, the ending didn't have the kick you'd expect. Otherwise, the existential horror aspect, along with the tension in the scenes, was right up there. Them, 1954. Police discover a little girl in desperate need of medical attention in a desert near Alamogordo, the location of the first nuclear test. They soon investigate the deaths nearby and come across a giant forager ant. They use a submachine gun to turn it into Swiss cheese. A mere mycologist theorizes that the ants must have been irradiated, mutating as a result. He requests a helicopter search, which results in them finding a gargantuan ant's nest. Cyanide gas bombs are tossed inside, and the hero follows much later to look for survivors. They find evidence that two queens have begun their journey to establish new colonies. They spot the queens shortly after. One hides in a cargo freighter, while the other runs amok in Los Angeles. The ants and their hatchlings are destroyed with flamethrowers, as they consider the possible consequences of the other nuclear test after the first one. One of the first giant bug monster films, Them, was quite an interesting watch. The special effects are obviously bad for today, but for the 50s, very intriguing. Lastly, if you want to blame the existence of Megashark versus Giant Octopus films, remember, this is where it all started. To be fair, Them remains to be the best one out of all the mega creatures destroying buildings genre. Carnival of Souls, 1962. A church organist, Mary, recently moved to Salt Lake City for her new job. Before moving from Kansas, she was part of a car accident, being the only survivor surfacing on the river underneath the bridge. After moving to the new city, she experiences a vision of a pale-faced man while driving near an abandoned pavilion. Mary learns about the pavilion's history, and later revisits it even though she was warned against it. Continuing to see the pale man in her visions, Mary tries to investigate the place further, but eventually starts having terrifying episodes of real dissociation from reality. Yes, real, as in she would physically be gone from reality for short periods. Scary if you ask me. Mary meets a psychiatrist like anyone would, and later returns to the church for practice. I found the next scene a little funny. She starts playing hymns, which gradually turn into creepy notes, scaring the hell out of the minister. The same night, Mary asks a man for company at her place, but goes hysterical, scaring the man away. The following day, she arrives at the pavilion and finds a ghoulish version of herself dancing with the pale man. They presumably catch her. Back in Kansas, the crashed car is finally pulled out of the water, revealing Mary's corpse within it. If you watch only one of the films on this list, you better make sure it's Carnival of Souls. Carnival of Souls is a very low-budget but ridiculous effective film that delivers excellent storytelling, plot, and script. The whole movie builds suspense until the end, leaving you with the taste of psychological dread in your mouth. And yes, there are a lot of questions. To be fair, those are better left unanswered. Night of the Living Dead, 1968. Two siblings, Johnny and Barbara, argue their way to a cemetery to pay respects to their father's grave. Johnny tries to scare his sister, but she's scared for another reason. A pale-faced man grabs a hold of her, trying to escape with her. Barbara gets a chance to escape and takes it at the cost of her brother's life. While running away, she enters a nearby farmhouse for safety. Too bad, because she finds out there are more like the pale-faced man. While exploring the house, Barbara comes across a disgustingly mutilated corpse, which only freaks her out more. On the escape from the house, she finds a survivor who takes her to safety, later making camp with them. One of them was bitten and falls ill. They turn on the radio to hear a news broadcast about the dead rising, attacking normal humans everywhere. Scientists say it has something to do with the Venusian probe's explosive return to Earth. The movie follows the survivors as they slowly lose their fight against the ever-marching undead horde. What can I say? It's a timeless classic for a reason. It's a relatively simple story, which succeeds in being unique for the time, and just creepy enough to be memorable. I love that the film focused on the characters with distinctive traits that come to light in a crisis. The human element makes it worth the watch. Although I must admit, it must have been much more effective back when it was released. We're much more desensitized to gore these days, so the shock factor is arguably lessened now. Freaks, 1932. A beautiful trapeze artist named Cleopatra learns of her fellow circus associate Hans' inheritance. She gets into a romantic relationship with the dwarf man, plotting to kill him with the help of circus strongman Hercules, and take his wealth for themselves. Hans eventually marries Cleo. Cleo poisons Hans' drink at the same wedding function. Yikes, I guess gold diggers were on a different level back in the 1930s. After drunkenly kissing Hercules in front of Hans, he comes to know about her affair. Double yikes. The other freaks of the circus hold an initiation ceremony for Cleo, accepting her as one of their own. Cleo finally freaks out when Hercules jokes about them, turning Cleo into a freak like them. She mocks them all along with the ceremony. In a drunken rage, she picks up Hans, parading him around like a child. Hans later becomes bedridden from the poison he was given. When Cleo gives him a poisoned medicine, he pretends to take it, while secretly planning to strike back against Hercules and Cleo. In the end, the freaks capture Cleo, turning her into a mutilated human duck with her eyes gouged out, her tongue removed, her legs cut off, and her hands melted to resemble duck feet. The rest of her torso was coated with tar and feathered to complete the look. Yeah, quite a grotesque and shocking film. I mean, I don't know what's worse, Cleopatra's personality or her outsides once they're changed to match it. It's worth noting that some versions of the film end with Hans consoled by his ex-fiancée, Frida, instead of the bad ending for Cleo. And another one shows Hercules turned into a castrato singer. I'm glad that we don't have the same mindset toward people with disabilities these days. The 1930s were extremely hard for them. This movie did a great job of sending the message to society back then. Eyes Without a Face, 1960. Outside the city of Paris, a corpse floats in the river and is identified as Christiane, Dr. Genesière's daughter. Here's where it gets complicated. Christiane still lives in her father's mansion, which is guarded by various dogs. The body was actually of the woman whose face was removed by Genesière in order to graft it onto his daughter's face. It's too bad because the operation fails, and Genesière begins to hunt for the next target. He attempts the facial transplant once again, resulting in initial success, but Christiane's body eventually rejects it, ending in her wearing her face mask again. The new victim? Yeah, she falls to her death in an escape attempt. Christiane's fiancé, Jacques, informs the police, who then carry out a sting operation and send a crook to Genesière's clinic. The police stop the surgery just in time. They take Genesière for questioning, but he dismisses them quickly, and they let go of him. Christiane, finally on the verge of a breakdown over her condition being the reason for her father's immoral work, kills Genesière's assistant to release the crook. She then sets her dogs free, one of which attacks Genesière, leading the other dogs to join in and maul him to death. Christiane watches him die. She walks into the woods with one of her doves. The film is criminally underrated, and one of the best examples of why black and white works so well for certain films. Weirdly contradicting, it shows both immense statism and surreal beauty. The doctor here is strangely grounded in reality, which makes it even more compelling. The dude isn't unhinged, he's just feeling the guilt of failing and deciding to act as such. Meanwhile, his daughter silently suffers as she witnesses the horrific operations for her sake, all of which fail. Even the side characters, such as the assistants, are portrayed with deep emotions and personalities. Very much on the psychological side of things, this one's a must-watch. Nosferatu, 1922. In the fictional hamlet of Wisborg, Germany, a real estate agent, Thomas, is tasked with traveling to Transylvania to visit a new client. Thomas discovers that the locals are frightened when he mentions his client's name, Orlok. The night he reaches the castle, Count Orlok greets him over dinner. Thomas cuts his thumb and is visibly repulsed when the Count offers to suck the blood off it. You'd think vampires would be rather upfront about it. The following day, however, Thomas wakes up with puncture holes on his neck, which he brushes off as mosquito bites. What kind of mosquitoes lived back then? Thomas reads the book about vampires he bought and realizes that Count Orlok might be a vampire. Scared to death, Thomas Alice hides under the bed covers, passing out. Orlok is in the room, leaving him no other choice. At the same time in Wisborg, Thomas' wife has a vision of her husband being in danger from Count Orlok. The following day, Orlok climbs into one of his coffins and is loaded onto the small ship sailing to Wisborg. As expected, the crew dies. He takes control of the vessel. He later moves into his new house unobserved. Thomas' wife finds out that a pure-hearted woman's sacrifice could stop the deaths caused by Orlok's presence in the following days. She finds an opportunity to lure Orlok into drinking her blood, and when he does, the sunrise causes him to vanish in thin air. Thomas weeps over his wife's death. A twist on the Dracula myth, Nosferatu is a certified classic. It feels unsettling to watch, and the image of Count Orlok is rather memorable. There's a reason why so many adaptations were spun off based on this simple story. Cat People, 1942. Irina draws Oliver's attention at Central Park Zoo while sketching a black panther. They make acquaintances and later head to her apartment. Oliver is intrigued by a beautiful statue in Irina's place. She explains to him that King John of Serbia is depicted fighting a large cat symbolizing evil. Irina also tells him of the legend, but Oliver seems dismissive. As they become more familiar, Irina reveals that they cannot advance any further romantically, since arousal would transform her into a panther. She's a descendant of the Cat People, the legend Oliver had previously dismissed. Of course, Oliver ignores her warning and proposes to her anyway. She surprisingly agrees. Yeah, I'm not sure why. After marriage, Oliver persuades Irina to talk to a psychiatrist while he confides in his assistant, Alice. Wrong move, since Irina figures something is up. She follows Alice one night and leaves a trail of dead sheep in her rage. Yeah, I know what you're asking, but wait for it. Irina dreams about her psychiatrist acting as King John and later steals the key to the panther cage at the Central Zoo. Push comes to shove when Oliver brings both women to a museum tour, but ignores Irina. Alice is stalked by an animal that night. Irina tells her psychiatrist that she's ready for Oliver, but he plans to divorce her since he loves Alice now. How convenient. As expected, Oliver and Alice later get cornered by an animal but escape. Later, Alice warns the psych, but he doesn't take the call. In the next session, he kisses Irina, leading to her transformation, leading to his death. Oliver and Alice arrive, but it's already too late. Eventually, Irina's transformation leads to her death. Oliver realizes that she didn't lie after all. Cat People is another underrated gem. It's the perfect example of how to generate suspense without much on-screen violence. After all, the foreboding dread aspect is the most forgotten in one of horror films today, and I honestly hope someone makes a faithful adaptation of this film today. Frankenstein, 1931. Henry Frankenstein, a young scientist, and his assistant Fritz successfully reanimate a dead body built with various parts stitched together, acquired in secret. Henry's fiancée Elizabeth is worried about his obsession, but instead this leads her to being brought to witness the experiment. Things go right until they don't, and Fritz's incompetence is revealed. This man used a criminal's brain for the experiment. Laugh at this man. The artificial monster, however, appears to be benign. Fritz again disappoints everyone by bringing a torch nearby, causing the beast to freak out. Deeming it unpredictable as well as violent, they confine it to the dungeons. They later hear screams and investigate the dungeon to find Fritz dead. Who would have thought? Of course, it's Fritz again. As Henry takes a break to prepare for his wedding, the monster finds a chance to escape. It comes across a young girl and plays a game together, but accidentally causes her to drown. It walks away remorseful. I can see why this scene was so controversial back in the day. Once the wedding preparations are complete, they realize their monster is loose in the house. Frankenstein's monster is hell-bent on killing him. Cue the angry mobs when the young girl's father shows up at the door. As fate would have it, Frankenstein gets separated from the crowd and soon confronts his monster. The monster takes him to the top of a mill, throwing him off of it. He barely survives due to the mill blades breaking his fall, but the beast isn't as lucky. It dies to the angry mob. Do I even have to talk about the story? Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is one of the greatest stories of all time. When you make a movie about it, well, it's bound to be good. One of the first cinematic adaptations, this one stood out from the rest because it depicted the story as plainly as possible. Sometimes, plain is good. Black Sunday, 1960. This story takes place in Moldavia, better known as Moldova today. In 1630, a witch named Asa, as well as her lover Javutic, are sentenced to death, being accused of sorcery. By who? By Asa's brother, no less. Before her death, Asa curses her brother along with his descendants. She dies a gruesome death. A metal mask with inward pointed spikes is hammered into her face. 2 centuries later, Dr. Choma and his assistant, Dr. Andre, travel through the region. They're forced to make a stop as their carriage breaks down. Out of boredom, they explore the nearby nearby area and find a crypt. Yes, you thought right. This story would have ended here if they had smartphones back then. They discover Asa's tomb and observe her mask through the glass panel. Choma accidentally breaks the glass, along with the cross above it. The glass cuts his finger. The blood drips onto Asa's scarred face when the mask is removed. The doctors later head to the nearby town. A series of events follow, which causes Javatich to arise telepathically. Lead Choma to Asa's tomb. Asa kisses Choma to enthrall him, and Andre seeks help from the locals. A set of altercations follow, leading to the witch's death by fire. It's quite an unusual film. I recommend the uncut version titled The Mask of Satan, a staple for gothic horror fans. The movie delivers a great story and soundtrack. While the story has been done over and over now, this one feels good enough to stand out on its own.
Suo nemico, io sono uno scienziato che vuole...
The Thing from Another World, 1951. A journalist, Ned Scott, is looking for a story in Anchorage, and he finds one that's good. An unusual aircraft has crashed near the North Pole. Joining the expedition with various other people, they head to the crash site, discovering a flying saucer. They also detect signs of life nearby. As an Arctic storm approaches, they recover from the unknown life form and retreat from the site. Back in the campsite, the frozen block of ice clears, revealing the alien life form within, causing one of the men to freak out and throw an electric blanket over it. Now fully thawed by the heat, the alien escapes but is attacked by the sled dogs. It loses almost half of its right arm. The crew recovered the arm afterward. The scientists conclude that the alien is an advanced plant life form and wish to communicate with it. They soon discover a third sled dog devoid of all its blood and realize the alien is a carnivorous plant that feeds on blood. Meanwhile, the alien hunts around, killing various people around the campsite. One of the scientists is caught growing the alien life form from its severed arm by feeding it blood plasma. The crew finally decides to fight against the alien when it sabotages the heating systems by setting up an electric trap. The alien is trapped and burnt to a crisp from electrocution. Scott finally has a great story to tell the world. Called one of the best sci-fi films of the 1950s, The Thing from Another World seems relatively evergreen, as it still fits in with today's first contact type of movies. It also influenced the future of sci-fi movies for a long time. Some of the scenes were quite remarkable, especially the kerosene scene. I would honestly recommend this film as a starter to this list, as it's really mild on the horror aspect compared to the others. Creature from the Black Lagoon, 1954. A geology expedition reveals a previously unknown species, a link between water and land-dwelling creatures. Dr. Reed, Dr. Maya, and others begin the expedition, but to their horror, the whole research team has been killed in a somewhat mysterious manner when they arrive. It's too bad for them. They don't know what we, the viewers, know. The team was killed by an unknown creature when it was agitated by the scared scientists. Frustrated at being able to find no other clues, the team decides to head to the Black Lagoon. The enigmatic creature quickly makes its presence known in the lagoon and takes out multiple people from the team. They fail in their attempt to escape the lagoon since the beast has blocked it. Unfortunately, the creature loses to the power of guns, eventually forced to retreat after getting multiple bullet wounds. It's left to the viewer to interpret whether the creature indeed died. The film immediately appeals to classic cinema and horror fans. The production was crude. You'd know the creature was just a man in a suit, but the creature design was genuinely fantastic. Blame this one for several future ripoffs and wannabes. I recommend the sequels too, they're fun to watch. The Haunting, 1963. This story is a narration of the history of said house. Hugh Crane constructed the house for his wife, but she died before even setting foot in it, as her carriage crashed into a tree nearby during her first visit. Consequently, Crane's second wife died from a fall down the stairs. His daughter died calling for her nurse, who eventually inherited the house. The nurse committed suicide for unknown reasons. The narrator, Mark Way, wishes to investigate the paranormal activity in the house. He's joined by the current heir of the house, Luke, a psychic, Theodora, and Eleanor, a person experienced with poltergeist activity. The group spends some time in the house, where they find all sorts of weird things about it. The first night already terrifies them with the voices of a little girl's laughter, and Eleanor feels drawn to the house for an unknown reason. The next day, they discover a cold spot in the nursery. The next night, they discover the words, "Help Eleanor come home," which freak them out. Eleanor's obsession with the house grows, and when she's told to leave by Markway, she takes the car out for a drive. Unknown forces turn the vehicle toward the tree, causing her to die in a crash. Another underrated gem. I find this particular subgenre of horror deeply unsettling. You know, the whole thing about paranormal forces messing with you in a house, writing scary things, and causing various events. So yeah, this one did a number on me. If anything, watch it because I recommend it. Also, please forget the 1999 remake. This is the real deal and a classic in my opinion. House on Haunted Hill, 1959. 5 people are invited to stay in a supposedly haunted house by an eccentric named Frederick. The conditions are that the power will stay out all night and all exits will be sealed. Any survivor will be given $10,000. To be fair, it was a considerable amount of money back then. Hilariously enough, the guests arrive in separate hearses, being told that they might need them for the return journey anyway. Each one gets a .45 caliber handgun for protection. Before the night begins, Frederick's wife warns the guest about her husband's true nature. The situation quickly devolves into mind games as the guests try to spook each other into shooting their guns. Some genuinely believe in the presence of ghosts and scary noises around the place. Frederick's wife pretends to have committed suicide, which only causes more chaos. In the end, a vat of acid becomes the primary killer for them all, except for the house owner as well as guest Watson, who says the ghosts are coming for him and us, the viewers, with a terrifying expression. Man, what an entertaining movie. That's why I didn't spoil the events any further. The low budget factor only adds to the equation, solidifying the vibes. It is impressive how there's an element of horror without anything truly supernatural happening. The Lighthouse. In the late 19th century, Young served as a wickie for a few weeks on an isolated island near New England. He's supervised by an irritable old man, aptly named Old. Young finds the scrimshaw of a mermaid and keeps it. Too bad it gives him weird visions of giant tentacles and mermaids in the lighthouse. The weeks continue. Young takes on more duties, all except for the lantern room. He encounters a one-eyed gull, which he tries to kill but is warned. Killing seagulls is bad luck, according to Old. Too bad he ends up killing it the day before he leaves. Bad luck ensues. A storm turns the tide for the men as they run out of rations, finding only more alcohol in the extra reserves. They progressively delve deeper into madness, and Young reveals his name is actually middle-aged. Finally, they get into a fight, which ends with middle-aged burying Old alive, and Old cursing him with a Promethean death. The film ends with Young missing an eye, eaten alive by seagulls. What a strange movie! It's hard to explain it with words. This is definitely one of those films you must experience to truly understand. It very much delivers visually, with black and white only enhancing the feel.
It belonged to a man who was crippled who accused his wife just as you're now accusing me. You must listen to me.
Dead of Night, 1945. Walter arrives in a country cottage, greeted by his host Elliot with various guests. Strangely enough, Walter has seen them all in a recurring dream and is able to predict what happens around the house before it actually happens. To test his claims, the guests begin to recite strange tales from their experience or knowledge. The race car driver talks about how he saw a hearse carriage for one person. Then, after being discharged from a hospital, he came across a bus with one free seat. He saved his life by not taking the bus, which soon swerved and crashed. A few tales later, Dr. Van Straten tells his story about a ventriloquist and his doll. Back in the country home, Walter strangles Dr. Van Straten and later hallucinates about the guest stories. He later wakes up to a phone call from Elliot with an invitation to the country cottage. His wife convinces him to take a trip, which shows the scene from the film's start, where Walter drives up to the place. I think the true horror is that the protagonist is trapped in a horror version of Groundhog Day, one of the first films with an approach where multiple vaguely related stories drive the main plot. This film inspired so many others like it. It's quite a creepy idea, and the movie showcases it pretty well. A field in England. During a skirmish, Whitehead, an alchemist apprentice, flees from his commander. He then meets another soldier, Cutler. They later meet 2 defectors, Jacob and Friend. They travel together, setting up camp that day, eating mushrooms except for Whitehead. They pull O'Neill, a rival alchemist, out of the ground? Yeah, I'm confused too. O'Neill assumes command over the group, talks about treasures, and takes them back to his camp. He then tortures Whitehead to work for him as a human divining rod. Hallucinogenic mushrooms are to blame for what happens next. Jacob attacks Friend, and an altercation causes Cutler to shoot Friend fatally. O'Neill kills Cutler for rebelling against him and pursues the others. Friend soon appears alive. They all fight each other, this time holding nothing back. Whitebeard buries his friends' bodies and returns to where he first met Cutler, Jacob, and Friend. Crossing the hedge, he sees himself with Friend as well as Jacob. One of the strangest films of all time. It's hard to point in one direction at what A Field in England is trying to be. Rather than confine it to specific genres, I'd prefer letting it be just as it is. It conveys a message, albeit convoluted and mixed with magic mushrooms. It's genuinely a very divisive film. Some find great messages, some find it a waste of time. Watch it to decide for yourself. Marvelous verdict. Well, that was a very exhaustive list, covering all sorts of horror subgenres. I enjoyed watching films I hadn't seen before, especially since I hadn't watched many black and white films in general. This experience opened my eyes to another new medium of artistic exploration, and perhaps black and white horror is my jam now. I recommend it 10 out of 10. I hope you enjoyed watching this video. See you next time. And if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one and be safe. Thanks, everyone.